Greetings, friends. You may recognize the man next to me, Matt Arrett, the man that I consider the greatest professional historian who may not technically be a professional historian, is back on the program. We were just talking about how he has attained that level of demand, almost like Scott Ritter, where Matt wakes up in the morning and has to talk all day. So we're very appreciative to have you here, man, because I had like one question for you, and this is a big question. So that's why we're here today. We got a little bit of time to talk. And I need to hear your opinion, because we were doing like a round table the other day, the Rogue News round table, and you mentioned something that I think is very good for someone who does a channel about things related to Russia. You said that Canada is the eternal wedge between Russia and America finding peace. So dude, let's kind of just jump right into that, because I think the audience knows who you are, and I think they like you. So what did you mean by this? Let's begin to break down this big statement here, because over all the years, dude, of like, I'm 41. I've never really thought about Canada as being the key problem between Russia and America.
Well, that's because Canada is not the key problem. It's the problem is that there is no such thing as Canada. That's the problem.
Oh.
It's a mythology. So we've been told this mythology that there is such a thing as the sovereign nation state called Canada, which it's its own thing. English speakers, they sound kind of like, they look kind of like the Americans down south. White people speak English, watch The Simpsons.
Yeah.
And but they're their own thing, and they make sovereign decisions on their own, looking out for their own sovereign national interests, and that's the way things have been wired, especially since 1867, which is sort of a good jump on point for this particular story that we're going to go through today. And I hope people find this interesting. I know I certainly,
even if they don't, I find it interesting, and that's all that matters here. So
that's right.
Okay.
So let's go with. Well, so here's the thing. The problem about Canada is really the British Empire. Canada has always been part of the British Empire. It is British Canada. The head of state of Canada is the sitting monarch, the hereditary power. The prime minister, whoever that might be, has to declare their oath of allegiance when they become a member of the Privy Council, which everybody in the cabinet and shadow cabinet, the opposition, has to pledge allegiance to. Is the Privy Council, which involves maintaining oaths of secrecy. That which is said in Privy Council must remain in Privy Council according to the sort of Chatham House rules. But this has been before even Chatham House was set up as part of the Rhodes Scholarship. And to declare their fealty and loyalty to his or her Majesty and their hereditary heirs forever and in perpetuity, as good servants must, or as good servants ought to. And people could just go and Google or YouTube Justin Trudeau's Privy Council oath of office, or even his Prime Minister oath, which is again declares his fealty to the interests of the British and of the monarchy and its hereditary institutions. The official head of state is not the Prime Minister. Just get that across. It is the Crown. It is whichever entity is sitting in the Crown, and the Governor General is the political manifestation in the colony of Canada of that power, that authority. And in every province of Canada, there is a lieutenant governor, which is sort of like a sub governor general that sits in sort of above the elected legislation component of each individual provincial government. Signed giving royal consent to whatever rule or judgment is passed. And generally, Canada is such a well-oiled machine that's been honed over generations that there's very little input that needs to be done on the part of the Privy Council or the Governor General from Britain, and that's generally the way it works. Of course, there's a shadow government as well that involves things like the Privy Council office, which is a highly bureaucratized instrument, which was first set up in, it's not just the Privy Council, which has about 400 members, some private, some Bronfmans are members of the Privy Council. Maurice Strong, the late Maurice Strong, godfather of the Great Reset, was a member of the Canadian Privy Council, as are the many members of Parliament. And not everybody is deployed to who was a member to do work in service all the time. But the reason why they became a member, why they were inducted, is that at a different point they had a role to play for the empire that required that they be harnessed, that they be brought into the inner club. The Privy Council office is much bigger. There's tens of thousands of employees in this machine. It works with the Prime Minister's office, and through that, things like the unelected deputy ministers, each one assigned to different members of Parliament, especially in the executive branch, carry out and organize much of the policies of Canada, both domestic and foreign, not really for the interests of Canadians per se, or the interest of Canada as a nation, which is why in the case of the last 60 years, most Canadians have not benefited in any way by the policies of globalization and of their own government, resulting in a destruction of, small and medium enterprises, food production capabilities. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say, though, so about this, like, I've heard of the Governor General before, but that could just be because I think he has a crazy official uniform, if I remember correctly, that's very fancy. But as an American, so I've heard of some of this, but with the Privy Council, is that something that they talk about on TV and in school? Or is it kind of like the deep state in America, where you never hear about any of this stuff until school's over and you start getting interested in this as an adult?
It's kind of like the deep state. It's something that you might hear about in specialized courses in poli-sci and university. It's something which is thrown about very loosely, but it's really only when you become a member, an employee within the Canadian Public Service, and you've been vetted, that you really get to sit in and appreciate the nerve center of command in the federal government that emanates in as I think the term deep state is a very, very apt comparison. The difference between the American deep state, in my analysis, and the Canadian deep state, of course, is that America actually has in its founding documents and core institutions something which is authentic as a sovereign nation, which broke free of empire, gave a lot of blood and sacrifice over the course of not just 1776 to 83, but really beyond that. There was a continuous fight to preserve and to try to perfect or bring about, actualize is another way of saying this, the principles enshrined within the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which were never permitted to properly blossom, and which always had enemies from abroad, from the City of London, but also from within, like Wall Street, as I pointed out in my book series, is a branch of British direction, a British-run fifth column since the 1790s within the heart of the United States itself, working to destroy America from within. But then you also have this other thing called Canada, which, if you get it, like, well, what was Canada before the American Revolution? It was just it was a French colony that had only recently been dominated by the British after the 7 Years' War, when the French lost to the British. And that was sort of the 1763 is sort of a good starting point when the most virulent expression of the British Empire was born in the, over the ashes of that international First World War, the 7 Years' War, which was a global war of the first of its kind. And so Britain came out on top. They took the Canadian colony of the French.
One thing is, didn't before World War I happen, wasn't the 7 Years' War the bloodiest war in human history? Or am I wrong on that?
That's what I read too. I read that too. It was a very nasty war, and again, it was everywhere. So I would believe that. Maybe then only superseded by the Napoleonic Wars. I think those were pretty bad too. Those are like nearly 20 years of ongoing war in Europe, though. Hard to say. I'd be curious. But definitely the 7 Years' War was a bloodbath internationally. The French had a lot of reasons to be angry with the British, who abused them quite a bit. And there was a lot of pro-American sentiment amongst the French colonists of the Americas, who wished very much to take part in the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which is why Ben Franklin was even up here for about 4 weeks in April to May of 1776 to organize and persuade a Canadian delegation of French Quebecois to go down and be the 14th colony to co-sign and be a part of the Continental Congress in preparation for the War of Independence. And unfortunately, though the population by and large supported that, the Canadian or the Quebecois administration by this time was firmly under the control of the Anglican intelligence, and especially a lot of Jesuit complicit Jesuit administrators who worked very, very carefully together to pass certain laws, like the one that was done by Bishop Briand, who was in charge at that time of Quebec, very Catholic, society, very much based upon the serfdom, the seigneurie system.
Mm-hmm.
And he passed an edict from the Quebec High Command Church, basically saying that anybody who chooses to fight with Washington will be excommunicated and thus burn in hellfire forever. Which unfortunately that dissuaded the vast majority of the Quebec farmers from picking up arms and fighting. And Ben Franklin left a little bit demoralized. That was one of his few failures in life, was not persuading Canada and underestimating the level of corruption of the elite of Canada, and also the underestimating too the level of illiteracy. That was a problem where the English-speaking American colonists had a different cultural vibe, where you had what was known as the Latin farmer, right? They could read Latin, they could read the Bible, they could read the classics.
Yeah.
By and large, literacy is very high in America. So the ability to read like Thomas Paine's Common Sense in the Americas was very high.
They were propagandizable in a way.
Very propaganda, yeah, for good or for bad. Propaganda. In the case of Ben Franklin's networks, it was very good that they were able to read about higher philosophical concepts and think about things like, well, why should I die for a concept like liberty and risk my family's security against the biggest empire in the world? That requires like a very elevated cognitive power in a population to
because
do
I
that.
think looking at it now, I mean, this is, again, we're in the 21st century, and I think this sort of cry for, we need to stand up for liberty. The concept of liberty was kind of new at the time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was not like you would just throw that word out there and the average person would be like, oh, yeah, you mean the freedom from aspects of government repression and the society based on the individual. Oh, that. Yeah, okay. Like, they didn't really...
Yeah, it's so much
that
higher
wasn't
than
worked
that.
out yet.
But the appreciation was so much more philosophically deep. I mean, when you think about the quality of mind power of the generation, especially of those who led in the organization, which was not about tea, it was not about not paying taxes without representation. These are mythologies that have been cooked up to diminish what was actually behind the planning that went into the American Revolution, which took generations. It was, decades and decades of planning and organizing had to go into preparing the groundwork culturally and politically for something like the American Revolution to even be possible. Benjamin Franklin played a key role in that, and it had nothing to do with my personal liberty to be left alone or not pay taxes or something. That was not it at all. It was something so much higher and much more noble. And the problem with the Quebec farmers is that because of the traditions of the feudal systems of France that were still what was shaping the administration of French Quebec, French Canada, there was a disencouragement of the plebes to access literacy, and so they couldn't read the propaganda. They couldn't read the appeals by the Continental Congress to defend the liberty of your grandchildren.
Is this like a cultural legacy thing, or were they actually still under serfdom in Quebec?
Oh yeah, you had a seigneurie system. It was a landlord, and the serfs lived on the seigneurie. It's essentially what it was. And in the case of France, there was a breakaway. There was more of a fight amongst an intellectual and industrial class. In the case of France, after the 30 Years' War that ended in 1648, there was a different sort of trajectory that was brought about to undermine the encrusted oligarchical power structures that had seen and tried to maintain the feudal system of human beings as cattle. And instead, these groupings around people like Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the finance minister, or Jules Mazarin, the orchestrator of the Peace of Westphalia, that set about that created the basis of the modern sovereign nation state system, instead said, no, let's actually treat human beings like they have minds. Let's provide mass education for the young, for people to get specialized training and build canals, build mills and other things that would increase the industrial production of society, or things like the Academy of Science. Let's actually create academies that specialize in the arts and science to cultivate the creative incubators needed to break free of the limits to growth. That was something that you had captured in the old France, but in the new France here in North America, that didn't quite take hold so much.
Yeah,
and
it was far away, was isolated, probably not enough people, really.
Yeah, there were small moments, little bursts, but they were always sort of undone by a very corrupt elite class up here that wanted to keep their fur. I mean, the whole economy was based upon just sort of exporting furs, and you had also, I think, a big part of this were the Jesuits,
Yeah.
which played a big role in the evolution of Canada from the 17th century, when they really began setting themselves up, utilizing synthetic pseudo-Christian cults to brainwash local native tribes and use and weaponize them in various ways throughout the entire 18th century, before the American Revolution even. And they interfaced very closely with a very big area, which most Canadians don't even know its history, but it's such a big part of our continental experience, which we should really know more about. It is Rupert's Land, or otherwise known as the Hudson Bay Company, which was, up until it was purchased by Britain and made part of the Canadian sort of official land. The Hudson Bay Company territory was, for about 260 years, a private British East India Company branch that controlled about 80% of the territory of today's Canada. Huge. All of the Arctic, all of, not just Hudson's Bay, but all the way up to Alaska.
Yeah.
Everything that is the territories, everything that is the Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, was all Hudson Bay territory. And it was administered again by British intelligence, British colonial officials who worked very closely with Jesuits. There's a high degree of infiltration, and not in infiltration, but enmeshment, let's just say that, as far as maintaining a global system of controls on behalf of an oligarchical elite of hereditary powers, that some of them find themselves in Britain, some in Italy and Venice, some in France. But while they have certain rivalries expressing themselves in these little, territorial battles in the 7 Years' War, or in the Napoleonic Wars, or later on in World War I or II, they have a common set of agreements that there's certain rules that have to always be maintained, that they will work together on, which involves principally destroying this quality of creative expression that sometimes appears within their slave cattle class of talking cows, that get ideas that make them unmanageable and make them more creative, both politically as well as scientifically and artistically, that make them more believe in the stupid idea that they're made in the image of a creator and thus have inalienable rights, which you can't let that crazy stuff get spread too much. So they'll work together to crush that.
Counter argument. It's kind of interesting. Why go with that strategy? Because I've always sort of wondered why the British in their empire, why they did so little to make people try to be endeared towards it. For example, as someone who lives in Russia, when you start in 1991, America comes into Russia, and whether they were doing good things or bad things doesn't matter. It made it seem like America was the savior. America was the golden key to the gateway of heaven. It is the best thing ever. Whereas it seems like the British throughout their empire didn't really do that much of it. They didn't really try to make the populace particularly like it. They just tried to sort of sabotage and make everyone infight with each other. Why no marketing? Or is that just a mystery of history?
No, dude, Tim, that's such a good point, because honestly, if it's like there's this concept in China, in Chinese civilization, that's tied to this Confucian idea of the mandate of heaven.
Yeah.
And that an emperor has the right and the authority to be an emperor to the degree that he adheres and obeys the principles of the heavens, right?
Yeah.
And so to the degree that you obey and you provide for the general welfare in your empire, you have earned the consent of the governed, and you have thus earned the authority of being an emperor.
Yeah, and
conversely,
so I think that if you screw up too much, you're done.
And Mencius, the disciple of Confucius, is very clear on that the people have the right to overthrow their emperor if he betrays the mandate of heaven and institute for themselves newer and better forms of government that actually abide by the mandate of heaven.
Yeah,
that's Mencius. Sounds a lot like Thomas Jefferson, but it's Mencius, which is why Benjamin Franklin was actually translating Confucius's Analects into the American colonies back in the 1739 period through his printing press. Yeah. And Benjamin Franklin was a student of Confucius, and he called himself, when asked, what inspires you? He says, I try to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, Socrates, and Confucius. That's in his own in his own writings, as he says, was what motivated him. And he even made the argument that America should be a meritocracy based upon the best principles of the Chinese administration. That is a meritocracy.
Yeah, that's what Confucius tried to lay out, is this system with the examinations and having to, for bureaucrats to prove that they have this deeper knowledge, is some sort of I don't know, stepping stone pathway to getting to the top of the bureaucratic hierarchy. Basically, you might be corrupt, but at least you're not an idiot if you're near the top of the pyramid.
You have to have some intellectual competence, and everything can be corrupted. Yeah. But the good thing about it is that you have to demonstrate some competent know-how. And, in the best of times, the Confucian classics, which have always been at the heart of the meritocratic systems of China over every successive dynasty, have been based upon a focus on not only respecting and reappreciating the traditions of the best classics, the poetry, the philosophical concepts in the five classics, but then also composing. Actually, do you have the ability to utilize the principles of poetic dynamics of the Chinese system and compose and create your own concepts, which is a fun aspect to this.
Is that why they made us write essays in American school for 12 years in a row, endlessly?
I think that was a bit of maybe a weak bastardized failure of it, maybe. Maybe they're trying for it and fell short. I don't know. But all that to say, this was the case of the Hudson Bay Company. So Canada failed to accept that moral challenge, and that's I got a whole book on that called The Untold History of Canada. And so instead, we stayed under a policy of bribery. Not only was it threats to excommunicate, but also the other thing was a little bit of like a carrot with the stick. The carrot was Britain said to the French that, look, if you stay loyal to the crown, we will reward you by granting you certain localized, autonomous legislative control over your religious and domestic, local, very local political administration, who's going to pick up the garbage type stuff. And we won't force Protestantism, or Anglicanism, I should say. We won't force that on you. You can keep Catholicism, okay? So there are little bribes like that were granted. And it was called, the policy was en fur râpé, which literally meant the wrap in fur wrapped policy, which means it's the warm blanket thing. So just stay with the mother. We'll wrap you in a blanket. And it'll be very comfy, but we're going to smother you, and you're not going to be allowed to grow. So we began, I guess, our fallacies of composition, that is the Canadian mythology at that moment, of accepting a society premised around hereditary structures. We also basically the some of the traders in America who wanted to stay loyal to the British Empire from the 13 colonies were given sanctuary, kind of like the Russian oligarchs. After Putin goes to war with them, where do they go? They go to like London and Florida.
They all go London, New York. Basically. 50, so 50% same thing there, 50% there. Gotcha.
Yeah. And the New York back in those days, that was the sanctuary, was English speaking. That's where English speakers in Canada came from. We're the United Empire Loyalists, and increasingly that became divided into an upper English dominated loyalist colony of Upper Canada, and then a more southerly French dominated society, but still under English economic rule in lower Canada, aka early Quebec, early Ontario. And and then there was the Hudson Bay Land. So like I said, the Hudson Bay Land was like everything else.
Yeah.
And throughout the 20th century, Canada just stagnated. We were not allowed to develop industries. We always had to stay under British free trade. So our populations stagnated in poverty. You had a local elite under the control of Great Britain called the Family Compact, which managed kind of like the British allied Brahmins of India under the British Raj. They managed their own system of Indian slaves on behalf of their masters in London. Same thing for a lot of the corrupt Chinese under British rule or British controls and manipulation during and after the century of humiliation. They create organized crime networks that are then loyal to British High Command and then locally managed, and that's the case for Canada. We had the Family Compact. And unfortunately, the compact was a little bit too iron fist and brutal with the population, which at a certain point became a bit of a pressure cooker. And we had a couple of rebellions in 1837 and 1838 in Upper and Lower Canada, coordinated to try to create, for the first and only time, a Republican revolution. Unfortunately, it was underripe. It failed under
why
the
didn't
leadership
the United
of
States support it? Or they didn't have the
because the United
resources
States
back
didn't
then?
have the United States at that time, unfortunately, in 1837-38, was under the control of a British traitor in the form first of Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was the guy who killed Hamilton, who tried to break up the United States on four different occasions.
I was like, a little confused when you said Aaron Burr. I was like, wait, what?
But he's going to come into the story. So after he comes back, after 5 years living in Jeremy Bentham's house, doing prostitutes and opium for 5 years, saying it's the best time of his life, he comes back and reconstructs his political machine. This is the guy who was the former vice president who tried to kill Jefferson in a coup d'etat in 1807, which is why he left America for 5 years to begin with, to avoid arrest. Yeah. He's the guy who sets up Wall Street by setting up the first Bank of Manhattan. He's the guy who kills Hamilton, and his political machine is huge. Mm-hmm. And so one of the key figures, or two of the key figures, is his personal lawyer, a guy named Martin Van Buren, and another guy who became an American folk hero, but who was one of his key collaborators, out of whose house or mansion in Virginia he used as his base of operations to try to break up the Union in 1807, Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson and Andrew Jackson and Van Buren both become successive presidents after John Quincy Adams. And in 1837 and 38, federal laws are passed in the United States that make it illegal for any American to assist in the Republican Revolution in Canada. There's a few who do try, many get arrested in America, but that support that they desperately needed of a patriotic, nationalistic America that understood its natural enemies of the British was not there anymore. That might have been there with John Quincy Adams previously, but John Quincy Adams...
That is a very suspicious legal package to pass. That is interesting.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but they were in the middle of self-sabotaging America from within as well. At that same time in 1837 was the year that the Second National Bank was destroyed. Mm-hmm. All of the national development projects that were being built up in the 1820s and 30s under the driving force of the national banking structure, which was not a Federal Reserve or proto-Federal Reserve the way the mythologists have created. This was the driving force that provided low-interest, long-term loans for industries, small and medium enterprises, and most importantly, things like the Erie Canal, the rail and roads and water projects and other things. There were so many things being built up that allowed America, under this particular system of national banking, to quadruple its population when Canada was stagnant. It did it not just in quantity, but also in terms of qualitative rates of increase of the productive powers of labor through industrial development, the leaping over limits to growth, the encouraging of new discoveries and their application in new technologies. That was the driving incubator of creativity. And Burr destroyed that from within. He seized everything up. He got rid of all or most of the protective tariffs that opened the door to the British dumping of cheap goods that destroyed local manufacturing. He opened the door with that to pure speculation because now the free markets were deciding what was value, which was basically the hedonistic impulses of people wanting to buy low and sell dear, which was not tied to reality. Mm-hmm. And with that became a speculative wanderlust where the biggest bubbles that had ever been seen were quickly built up and popped, creating the bank panics of 1837-38. And during this whole time, Andrew Jackson was also assigned to destroy the native communities by extracting the share.
What I was going to say. Jackson became sort of as a sort of a counter argument. He sort of was associated with, perhaps you could say, expansionism. He could be like Ivan IV if Ivan IV just murdered everyone. That's one of the problems, because that's one of the funny things living here is how, boy, every, speaking of that British methodology, every history book about Russia that's been written by Americans always makes Ivan IV out to be an Andrew Jackson-like figure when the actual reality of things was quite the opposite. But anyways, he was a successful expansionist. Isn't that good for America, Matt?
Well, there's a lot. It goes back to the mandate of heaven, Tim. So the mandate of heaven is what is always our go-to point, right? In the English or the Western lexicon, one might call this the natural law concept. So if you do something, like in the case, people say, okay, is America's an empire? if Canada were to have joined America, would that have not made Canada back, in 1776, a colony of the American Empire? Well,
No,
at the time,
I don't
it
think
would not have.
No.
No, I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't. But
I
but
think
if
it
it
would have
happened,
come in on equal footing, because people forget that the original 13 colonies were not exactly the economic titan that America was in the 20th century. I mean, especially when you're like Georgia was a prison colony, and oh gosh, what was it? Maryland was mostly full of Catholics just because they need to shove them somewhere. I mean, this is a completely different reality. And I think
totally
Canada might have
And
actually been, if Canada as a whole of what we consider Canada today became the 14th colony, it would have been the big dog, maybe even too big. The other colonies might have been like, we might need to break you up, pal.
Yeah. Well, this is why, look, growth at the end of the day is only contingent upon, is it legit or not? If it's legit, it's because it's contingent upon an idea of morality and the mandate of heaven, in my mind. So if you want to go and suppress the weak or impose your will onto the weak or enslave those who you think are lesser than you, if that's in your heart as a motive driver of a policy of growth, no, you're going to lose the mandate of heaven. You're going to ultimately create the seeds of your own eventual self-destruction down the line, because you're going to build up a lot of resentment. You're going to build up a lot of fallacies in your own system that will then collapse. It'll be a weak foundation. And the more you build it, the weaker that foundation is going to be to support a structure that will ultimately collapse. Now, at the same time, if you grow in a way which involves a love of thy neighbor at the same time, where you're not imposing or suppressing slaves, but rather helping to uplift people to a better way. Take, for example, I think of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. For all of the problems that people might have with it, if you look at it's certainly a growth policy of the Chinese Dao, the Chinese way of thinking about development outside of their country and internally within as well. But it's based not upon the idea of colonial suppression of the weak natives and destruction of their habitats to enslave them. It's based upon something that we can recognize and measure as the increase of the quality of life and longevity of the people who are benefiting by the new water projects, the new electricity grids, and other things. So I think if you grow with that idea, it's not a bad thing. But Jackson was all about, this guy was a ardent racist to a very high degree.
Yeah. Because
he was ready to launch the wars.
Matt, is if you think about it, things would have been, especially about this, like almost you're talking about sort of like this, the consequences of, I don't know, it's really cliche to talk about karma, especially as someone of a European appearance, but it's almost like a karma thing where they could have honestly just, how should I put this? They could have just absorbed the Native Americans. Like, there was really no necessity to kill everyone, because someone could say, but they wanted the land. So what? They could have worked the land. I mean, people are late. I guess it's hindsight, like looking at it now in the 20th century, that these people with higher technology are going to go over there and be like, look, guys, you do have this kind of cool traditional lifestyle, but guess what? The way we live is easier. So you're eventually going to gravitate to it one way or another. Why don't you do the farm work? There were so many ways that it didn't have to be that way. You didn't have to that's clear the field. I don't know.
And that's why the Cherokee were so targeted, because the Cherokee were the most advanced in terms of embracing the best of Western technology, while at the same time maintaining their own traditions and cultural linguistic experiences. So they were farming. They actually recognized the superiority of having agriculture.
Yeah.
They were working in harmony with many of the whites on a very good basis of respect before Jackson. And we didn't see a destruction of their songs, of their mythologies, of their language. That was still protected, but at the same time they were also learning English. They were also learning how to use farming techniques, and so that had to be destroyed, because it was too much of an example for the other tribes around North America who were also ready to follow suit. So that's what Jackson was first assigned, and I say assigned because I don't think he was ever his own man, to crush by extracting the Cherokee in the Trail of Tears, of which about 4,000 died, moving them from their ancient lands in the South. And those lands were then given over to the slave power to then grow cotton. And up between Jackson's administration, where there were 2 million black slaves in America, they might have legalized the import of new slaves from Africa, but at the same time, that population grew to 4 million, doubled within 25 years by 1860 when the Civil War broke out. So they were breeding these humans like cattle over land that was formerly under the control and ownership of natives, right? And so that was a bad version of Manifest Destiny. They did that through the conquest and the destruction of Republican movements in Mexico. That later on, Hawaii got a taste of what this policy was. So you've got, but there's two different variations of the Manifest Destiny. I just pointed out the one good version of the Chinese Manifest Destiny, which is Go West. Go West, young man in China. That's what you see right now at the Belt and Road Initiative. And under the best of times, that exact same principle and philosophical view animated the best of the westward expansion movement in America. The worst of it was the racist Jacksonian slave-loving versions, which is the only one we're taught today. So when the students today are whether they're in Canada or whether they're in the United States, being trained by Soros-funded education systems to learn how to hate America properly, as they should, they're only given that one-dimensional evil variant of Manifest Destiny that they're told rightfully they should hate, but they're not told about the other legit version that was under the mandate of heaven. So all that to say, this gets us to our current story, because the question is really, why is Canada a wedge historically between U.S., Russia, and China?
My job is the host. I'm the one who's supposed to keep you on track. Now you're keeping yourself on track. You're making my job too easy.
Sorry, man.
I'm sorry. It's okay. It's okay. I just wanted to point one thing also out too. It is, if you also look at a map of sort of the way the population of the United States has wound up, even after the more brutal Manifest Destiny, the sort of interior is a lot more empty than all the edges. So in a lot of ways, it's the real tragedy of what happened to Native Americans, because if they just would have populated the edges, what they were going to like what happened anyways, they could have just left them in the middle. All those states, the flyover states, they probably could have just left everyone where they were, and nothing fundamentally would have changed.
No, I mean, I think you really did need to work with the philosophy of integrating, but not necessarily. The word assimilation gets very Borg-like.
Left them alive. I don't mean completely left them alone. I meant left them living. Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, like, okay, if Oklahoma would have been sort of just left to, maybe some of the bureaucracy, some of the constitutional rights come in, some of this, that, and the other, the technology eventually grabs hold of people, again, it could have been done in a friendly way. But anyways, now we'll do my job. And okay, so here we go. I'm starting to see.
Yeah, there's more organic way to do it. And wait, but before we do that, actually, because you made a point, the Andrew Jackson thing, you got to keep in mind, what did he do? He didn't just move them out of the South. He then created through the Native American or the Indian Removal Act, he created the reservation system. So the very reservation system that has rewarded and put the First Nations peoples into these allocated zones and punish them if they want to leave, because now you don't get your tax incentives or anything else if you leave that allocated zone for you. It's kind of like an invisible concentration camp in many ways, with no economic opportunities, but a lot of access to narcotics and other things that are made very abundant and easy to access as part of an intentional social engineering policy. To keep these people in a state of, I mean, it's a genocide policy against the natives that never went away, but it masquerades under this virtuous...
Having met people who did volunteer work at Indian reservations, they confirm everything you're saying.
Yeah, and it's bad in Canada. I mean, same thing was done in Canada, and this gets us, at the question of like, okay, so the good Manifest Destiny was, look at what a big moral fight in America was obviously the British. Would America be able to survive the British instigated Civil War, which is never taught the way I just said it? So the way I just said it.
They did tell us in schools that the British sided with the South. They did at least mention that.
Did. Yeah, but they didn't say to what degree. Because when you actually look at what degree, not only was this thing cultivated over the course of many, many years, it took a long time to plan out. And the British always knew that this was the Achilles heel of America, the unresolved issue of the incongruity of the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, and the reality of the addiction to slave labor for much of the states, for many of the states. The British always knew that they could capitalize and work that weak spot to the point of a breaking point. And they tried that on at least 4 other occasions before the final war, or the war finally was able to be induced in 1860. But they had tried that, like I said, all under Burr's lead from 1797 all the way till 1807, and then again once more between that time. But okay, so why am I saying this? So Britain supplied the weapon, tons of weapons, warships, battleships, money, financing. They bought 80% of the cotton that was being produced by the Confederate South, the
Oh, well, there you
slave
go.
power. 80% of that was being bought for the textile industry in London and Manchester, which itself was the global monopoly on textiles because they had destroyed that in India earlier, and they got India instead to make up for that lost revenue by producing opium, which then the British oversaw, that made sure that that would go to China to keep the Chinese dragon subdued and destroyed and corrupt.
And this fills in that gap in the school books, because even as a teenager, I noticed that they taught us that, like, okay, well, the South lost the war because they had no industrial capacity. But then in the next paragraph, they say the American Civil War was the first truly industrial war. Then you're like, then how did they last 4 years in the first truly industrial war with zero heavy industry?
Exactly.
Now we know. Now we know, because the heavy industry was somewhere else. It wasn't in the South.
That's a wonderful paradox. That's exactly it. Yeah, Britain had the monopoly of industry, but they, again, industry, I like industry, you like industry, but at the same time, industry is not intrinsically good if you disobey the mandate of heaven. And if you read Charles Dickens and you look at how Britain used child labor, it was effectively forms of enslavement, debt slavery, where they got debtors into debtors' prison to do like manufacturing work. That was a form of hardcore slave abuse that kind of undermined the moral vitality of the industrial systems that they had access to, but because they used them for the wrong reasons. They weren't trying to uplift people to a better way, but they rather just take the monopoly and crush the world competition. So in the case of the South, as you pointed out, they didn't have the industrial might to make the things that they used. So who did? Well, it was Britain. And they were getting logistic support. British intelligence was very sophisticated, also working with their New York branches to destroy and disrupt the Union from within, and also Canada. So British Canada was a Confederate intelligence base of operations that was supplied to them through like St. Lawrence Hall in Montreal. That was where John Wilkes Booth was deployed to get his payment, his commands for 5 weeks in 1864, before he was deployed back down to take part in the broader conspiracy to kill Lincoln, which did occur a few days after the Civil War was finished. But again, it was Montreal, Canada. So Lincoln was actually fighting a threefold war, both from within the traders of his own Wall Street-run administration under people like Albert Gallatin, the son of the first Gallatin trader who tried to destroy the U.S. Navy with Burr back in the 1807 period. And that guy's very son becomes the head of the New York Banking Association, which was the association that told Lincoln, we'll give you loans to carry out the war on 35% interest rate, and under the condition that you abrogate any rights of the national government to have any influence over the emission of currency forever. And you give us, which was later
the initial
actually
plan
done
for the
with
Federal Reserve System.
That's what they laid. Yeah, that's exactly it. So that's where Lincoln said, well, I can't work with those conditions. They're going to destroy me from within. Meanwhile, he's dealing with terrorist operations being deployed by the Confederate operations from the north, from Canada, running the Albany raids and other things. And he's basically saying, well, the only solution is listen to Henry C. Carey, my lead economist, who's a Hamiltonian Whig, and bring back a national bank. But he fails in his fight to bring back an official national bank. So instead, what he does as a compromise is he initiates the greenbacks through acts of treasury. He basically says, okay, we're going to print our own money. We're going to use that as the basis of a fiat form of currency, but not fiat in the sense of it not being tied to anything, because what it will be tied to will be the future production that we will build up by building the transcontinental railway, by building up the various internal improvements, the big infrastructure and industrial projects.
Proto-Stalinistic. That's interesting.
Exactly that. It was super much, exactly that. And that this is the key thing. I think with Stalin, you got to look at people like Vladimir Vernadsky, the president of the Russian Academy of Science, who was very close to Stalin and who himself was a follower of Lincoln. And his father was a translator of Lincoln and Henry C. Carey's speeches in Russia, in St. Petersburg, and actually in Ukraine. That's where he was based in the 1880s and 90s. Vernadsky was born in 1864. And or 1863, and studied these thoughts of Friedrich List, the protectionists, the national banking followers of the American system of Hamilton and Lincoln that were being deployed in Russia, especially under Alexander II in a big way. And then Alexander III, even bigger way, and people like Sergei Witte, and the finance minister and later prime minister, and his whole network were major proponents of this Lincoln American system in Russia. So all that to say, why did Lincoln succeed? It wasn't just the greenbacks. That played a big role, but it was also the Russians who, Lincoln didn't, right before Lincoln put forth his Emancipation Proclamation, you had Alexander II dealing with a very similar problem, which was, what do we do with the 25 million serfs who are, we don't have employment to absorb that labor force. We don't have, that's a huge economic crisis when you just free a bunch of slaves. Well, if you don't have a productive economy to absorb that, like, what are you going to have then? And same thing for Lincoln, thinking about like the 4 million black slaves with no education, a culture of slavery. And what do? You need to have trade schools, training. You have to have industrial production for them to work in, so that they're not just going to be talking cows like they've been expected to be for their whole lives. So Russia and the U.S. had similar problems. They also recognized similar enemies, because America was the only nation in 1856 who came in support of Russia in the Crimean War, which was a giant British Anglo-Ottoman, trap to undermine and destroy Russia by getting it to misstep, which it did. But America was a friend of Russia, because they had a memory that it was because of Russia and Ekaterina Dashkova and Catherine the Great that you had the League of Armed Neutrality that allowed for the American Revolution to work. It was the Americans that brought in people like George Washington Whistler on the request of, I think it was Alexander I, who built the first railway between Moscow and St. Petersburg. It was an American engineer who was invited to go to Russia to plan out and build that first rail project in Russia, modeled on the U.S. experience. Unfortunately, Russia still had a bunch of, I think, bad manifest destiny ideologues managing some positions of influence in the 1850s, who were like, oh, a weakened Ottoman Empire with territories that are ripe for the grabbing. They jumped right into that stupid trap, thinking that they could grow and expand rightfully, and they didn't realize what was set up for them. Kind of like what was done in the early 80s with the Soviets, misstepping and getting sucked in, but that was for a different reason, actually. But it was a sort of similar trap set, right? And so when Alexander II comes in, you got a whole bunch of reformers around, Grand Prince Constantine, his brother, who's a really high-level quality intellect who studies this system. People like Ambassador or Finance Minister Gorchakov and Ambassador Edward de Stokel, the Russian ambassador to the United States, are brilliant grand strategists who all understand British grand strategy and manipulations. They organized to get the Russian fleet to be deployed to the coasts of New York and California, right? Which, I mean, this is such an exciting story that most Americans are not told about. It's just, and you had parades, pro-Russian parades in California and New York, and you could see the illustrations in the magazines and newspapers of the day celebrating the Russian soldiers who had come as and delivered a message directly to the British and French, saying, if you go militarily openly now supporting the Confederate South the way you've been promising you would, that will be war with Russia, which Britain wasn't equipped to fight at that time, a two-pronged war. So that kept them out, and it gave Lincoln the space needed to go on and fight. But as Alexander II had said to Wharton Barker, the banker, published in a newspaper decades later, he admitted that, I would have given the order, or the commanders of those ships did have the order to go to war with Britain if there was a hot war started with Britain invading from Canada, because the British troops there were 10,000 British troops in Canada throughout the Civil War, ready to attack. Same thing for the French troops under Maximilian, who were set up in Mexico, ready to attack north and support the Confederacy from the south. That was all in place. So it wasn't looking good. It was a bit of a miracle.
The scale of the Civil War, I mean, 10,000 troops is not few, but was that really enough to be that much of a game changer, or is it the fact that they'd be coming sort of from behind? 10,000 seems awfully...
It was that they were coming from behind. They didn't have any defensives significantly in the north.
Nothing up there,
And it would have been probably part of a first wave, so a first front of attack, while the British brought more of their ships in from the old the old world. So it would have been part of a multi-wave attack process. So all that to say, what was Canada? Canada in this process, something bugged me. Here's one of the key paradoxes of Canada was that our Constitution might have been it was approved by in London.
Yeah.
by the crown in
sign.
1867.
Russia's
And it was
constitution was
made.
approved by American advisors, so I feel your pain.
That's funny. Yeah, so that was 1867, but it was drafted in 1864 in Charlottetown on the Maritimes.
Oh.
So I'm like, why was it that it was drafted in the course of the Civil War in the United States? That's the Canadian founding fathers are those who are drafting it. But unlike the American founding fathers who are actually like risking their lives, the Canadian founding fathers are just having a champagne-soaked orgy for about a month drafting this thing. And it's known to be the biggest consumption in the 19th century of champagne and prostitutes in one location over the course of a 30-day period. Which then drafts this thing that pretty much enshrines, as people would read, no Canadian really knows, or every American kind of has an idea of their constitution and the preamble.
Yeah.
You know, we the people of the United States in order to form a more perfect union hereby. So you can generally, have a pretty good idea. Even Canadians knew generally what this is.
Mm-hmm.
Ask a Canadian what the Canadian Constitution says in its preamble, and I guarantee you, unless they're specialized, they will not have a clue. They don't know.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why. It's because if you read the damn thing, it says so on the first page that we are formed in order to preserve the interests of the British Empire. Not any other reason but that. And then if you keep on reading the different articles in the charter, the what's called the British North America Act that confederates the four somewhat independent, upper lower Canada, 2 maritime colonies. And then there's this other thing called British Columbia as its own colony, separated by this private region called the Hudson Bay land, the Hudson Bay Company land. So that's its own thing. So the thing that also it stipulates is that our government will be centered upon the control of a privy council, a governor general, and it enshrines the deep state within the Constitution, within the structures. And then the democratic brand aspects are a very outward limited form, more just for an opiate for the masses. Whereas, and this again gets at the original question earlier on in this discussion with you, was that in the U.S. case, there's something authentic in the core of the U.S., but then the deep state is like an appendage add-on, corrupting it from the outside. Whereas in America's case, the deep state is built into it from the get-go, and then anything good is kind of like,
well, you meant in Canada's case, it's on the inside.
In Canada's, in Canada's case, it's in the core, So Russia saves the U.S. in 1863. After Lincoln dies, again, carried out and directed from British Canada. And there's a book called City of Secrets, which I go through in volume 1 of my Clash of the Two Americas in depth, which proves this case completely. After this, the Russians, so there's 2 things. One, you've got the Republican movement in Canada, which is pro-Lincoln. And there's people whose names most Canadians don't know, like Isaac Buchanan, who's in charge pre-Confederation of most of the government under the then Liberal Party, a very different beast from today. And he's pro-Lincoln. He's a big pro-industrial poet, like one of these poet statesmen who's pro-industrial. And he is a powerhouse. He's organizing to create what's called a Zollverein of North America. That's got the name from what Germany was doing under Friedrich List, who took the Hamiltonian policy of consolidating the different diverse independent states of the early Americas under a union with a federalized credit, a new unified currency, one bank, and also a protective tariff to protect from foreign manipulation economically. So that's what was done in Germany to great success, which allowed Germany to become a real industrial challenger to Britain's hegemony. And this is what was then being proposed by the better Lincoln Americans and Isaac Buchanan and his Canadian industrialists. His policy was either Canada becomes an independent republic or we join America, but whatever, we just can't be we can't be a toy of the British anymore. But there was a little bit of a coup. He was ousted in 1864. His enemies took power in Canada. They're the ones who then set the stage for the drafting of the British North America Act. And as I point out, I think it's a useful way to think about this. The British had 2 anti-Republican North American projects to destroy America destroy the United States experiment from America. One was a Southern Confederacy, which failed. The other one was a Northern Confederacy, which worked. The Southern Confederacy failed. The Northern Confederacy worked. I got to restate that because people forget what this means. That's why Canada was a confederation, is a confederacy. And so part of that was then, how do you keep, because Britain is getting weak. They don't have the economic incentive to persuade their colonists separated by half the globe in Canada to stay with them. So they got this political structures. They got some elites in place who are traitors, but the people still kind of have their hearts pro Lincoln. That's the case of most Canadians, and a lot of the industrial class too recognize that America in the South is where the spirit of the love of progress is emanating, and they wanted to be a part of that process. So how do you crush that? Well, part of it was, we need to centralize and unify the whole upper part of the continent, because it was only a question of when the U.S. under Ben Franklin in Washington had set up the Continental Congress, not the Congress of the 13 colonies. The idea was to always kick out the hereditary oligarchical structures, which had dominated different parts, French, Spanish, British. Russia didn't have too much interest. They had a little bit of Fort Roos and a little bit of Alaska, but they didn't have too much enmeshed in North America. But anyway, it was more the French, the Spanish, and the British that had to be kicked out to create a new type of order. And it was so the idea of the Continental Congress was being discussed once more with the victory of Lincoln. And the appreciation of Russia was very, very high in the hearts and minds of everybody in America and a lot of Canadians. So how to get all of that northern part separating the newly purchased Alaska, which the Russians under Stokel and William Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, who got stabbed like 18 times the night that Lincoln was killed. People forget that there was an attempt to kill his Secretary of State. Yeah. And luckily, the story of Seward was that he had just gotten pushed under a horse and carriage. And so like half the bones in his body were broken, and he was like in like total plaster cast and metal everywhere. And that night when the assassin came in with his knife, he couldn't get any vital organs because the guy's like in the cast. Acid saved him. And then Seward's son came in and fought with the assassin, and the guy jumped out a window. But Seward was badass, and it took him like a couple of months to finally like get back in the job. And he immediately went to work with his buddies in Russia to initiate the secret diplomacy around first sailing Alaska, which they called Seward's Folly, because they're like, it's so cold. You just spent $7 million on like cold wasteland and no vision, right? But the idea was to then extend Lincoln's Transcontinental Railway, which it was begun in 1863. Yeah. I think the most impractical thing to do amidst the Civil War is to like start a continental rail line, but he does that. Yeah. It's finished in 1869, and the idea was to then extend that through British Columbia, which at the time had a very big pro-American annexation movement because they were economically devastated in BC.
And to go up towards the Bering Strait where the gap is smaller.
Yeah, exactly. And they were already in discussion. Seward was already in discussion with his Russian counterparts on building a telegraph line first, followed by a rail connection through the Bering Strait into Eurasia, where they were already setting the groundwork for what was later to be known as the Trans-Siberian Railway, which was done with the help of American expertise. You had like American economists and engineers were up there working with their Russian friends, co-building this thing. That all of the rail cars that moved along the Trans-Siberian Railway when it was finally finished in 1905 were all built in Philadelphia. They were all part of the Baldwin Philadelphia locomotive industry that produced all of the rail cars, all of the rails, the actual like it was and Russia was very quickly adopting an industrial ironworks and manufacturing built upon the U.S. model with the use of protectionism. For example, Dmitry Mendeleev, right? The beautiful scientist of Russia, one of the greatest Russian minds in history, who is the mentor of Vernadsky. This guy, not only is he discovering the harmonic law of the periodic table of chemistry, but then he's also leading the Russian delegation in 1876 to Philadelphia, where they're celebrating the centennial exhibition. And so Mendeleev is spending months in America studying the American system of industrial growth. How was America able to, within 1 century, do what they did, recover from the Civil War, outproduce Britain in almost everything qualitative? And he is assigned to work with Count Sergei Witte, and Mendeleev is the chairman of the Committee on the Protective Tariff Against British Free Trade in Russia, overseeing the use of protective tariffs to favor and stimulate the development of local agro-industrial growth in Russia.
Yeah.
And also charting out the different mining potentials within the Russian Arctic far north, which is always recognized, like that's Russia's manifest destiny, is the go east, which is what Putin has tried to revive with a bit of resistance from some forces within Russia that I don't...
Some delightful people whose numbers are slowly, but unfortunately very slowly dwindling.
Yeah, but it's the right trajectory down for them.
Yeah.
But so that's like, again, what Mendeleev and Witte were doing, and the idea was to always connect that through Vladivostok all the way up into Siberia, into the Bering Straits. And there's maps. Nicholas II is endorsing teams of American engineers to go and do surveying of this connection. How he spent something like $6 million paying American and Russian engineers to go up into the Bering Straits and actually survey and chart out what would be the best pathways to build either a bridge or a tunnel. They didn't really know back then what best. It probably would have been a bridge back then. Today we would probably want to do it as a tunnel. But so how did this fail? When you had so much moving in that direction, Britain was super weak. They'd expended themselves so much in the opium wars in China. That was hugely expensive and wasteful for Britain to keep China subdued. They were also organizing a British-directed civil war in China under the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, supported by the British in many, many ways, just like they were at the same time in the United States. They'd just done the Crimean War. They'd spent 2 years trying to put down Indian uprisings in 1860. So the world was kind of waking up very quickly to the evil and the true nature of the British Empire and to the superiority of this other way, this other Tao of doing political economy, centered around win-win cooperation, finding points of creating value instead of just consuming, right? All of this stuff.
Yeah.
And Canada was like I said, so you had a huge annexation movement in the colony of British Columbia, separated by like 3,000 kilometers away from the other British colonies of Upper Canada, Toronto, by this private land of just extraction, Hudson Bay. They all wanted to join America, and they had a lot of support from Ulysses S. Grant to make this happen. So why didn't it work? Well, number one, it didn't work because Frederick Seymour, there was a British governor I think it was from Ireland, but he was the one employed to be he was the Governor General of British Columbia colony. He was actually a good guy, and he was defending the annexation movement and giving them as much space as they needed to negotiate with the Americans to start working to become another state of America. Unfortunately, when John A. Macdonald, who's the Canadian George Washington, pro-Aryan, racist, drunken fanatic, makes Andrew Jackson look like a good guy. This is the guy who's celebrated to Canadians as being like the greatest Canadian hero. He gets wind and basically sets up a situation where it looks to me like Governor Seymour is killed. He basically is deployed to the Arctic, comes back dead. The new guy who's brought into his place, Cosimo D'Amore, is the new governor assigned.
That's a very British-sounding name.
It's a kind of Italian name, but he gave himself this name. The guy's a mystic who talks to the dead. Weird character. A lot of these creatures are all doing seances. They're all into parapsychology as part of like British intelligence operations. It's kind of weird. But and they're doing like opium. They're all like into this. It's not that different really from the transhumanist drug cults today, trying to create a new synthetic
to be honest,
religion.
Dude, one thing I've noticed when Russian people talk about like the history, a little bit of like their like popular literature and stuff, the same people that I would define as shitheads today are the exact same as they were in the 1800s. It's just there's more of them now because we're sort of overall wealthier, but the cosmopolitan bourgeois, like 20-somethings with no kids, writing their poetry, thinking it's the most important thing in the world, it was like that in the 1800s too. Oh, and the drugs were maybe a little bit more accessible back then.
It was probably like that back in the Roman Empire and
I wouldn't be
Persia
surprised.
as well.
I would not be surprised at all.
This is effeminate flakiness in the blue blood useless class.
Of course, because even back in ancient Rome, if you're part of that super elite, you probably weren't doing too much heavy lifting. Maybe they made you serve in the army though, depending, but maybe there were ways out of it. So,
Well, they called them blue bloods for a reason. That's because it's not because they were lizards necessarily. Maybe they had too much of the reptilian brain active, but it's because they're you could see their hands were so unactive and not tinged by sunlight.
Yeah,
because they never did any outdoor actual labor that you could just see the blue veins so easily in their pasty ass.
One thing, Matt, that actually finally I now know the reason for that. I actually appreciate it because I never knew that. But you have to go, and we haven't really touched on our question. Are we doing a part 2 here another day? Because you're already late for your next appointment.
My next appointment, I moved it to 5.
What?
I moved it to 5.
Oh my goodness. So guess what, guys? We're going to do part 2 with Matt starting right now.